In celebration of 1,000 subscribers, I have chosen to conclude Season 1 of Abandoned in a big way, by going back to the series' roots. We are following up on the first two episodes covering SeaWorld Sydney and the Darling Harbour monorail, covering what was originally intended to be the focus for the channel, Darling Harbour, a major area of Sydney, and a landmark construction of Australia's bicentennial, almost totally lost to time. This episode of Abandoned will be looking at the original Darling Harbour, from 1988 until 2013. Let's get into it. Darling Harbour is a major tourist area of the Sydney inner city. Initially constructed in its current leisure plaza form in 1988, the area has undergone a comprehensive rebuild over the last few years and looks like this now. We are looking at the old Darling Harbour, as built for the bicentenary in 1988, not the new one. In the late 1970s, where Darling Harbour presently stands now, used to be a collection of dockyards and freight rail facilities. The area had previously been a stronghold for cargo rail traffic on the extensive Sydney freight rail network, particularly before World War II. However, post-war Darling Harbour's activity slowed down. In the following years, the area declined, as freight traffic was moved away from the centre of the city to decentralised transport hubs, particularly in Kelowna, Port Botany and Port Kembla. It served primarily as Sydney's hub for freight, with the whole precinct being within walking distance of a CBD. Over time, with the Darling Harbour area becoming a rundown industrial area, it was questioned what could be done with the valuable land. An inquiry into the New South Wales transport industry in the late 70s found that the worn-down Darling Harbour freight terminal was inefficient, ultimately recommending the area be closed and the land repurposed for other uses. In response to this, years later, in 1984, the Premier at the time, Neville Wran, announced his government's intention to completely revamp the Darling Harbour area into a place for people, promising its completion by Australia's bicentennial, the 26th of January 1988. The purpose of the area was to serve as Sydney's legacy of the bicentenary. Overseeing the construction was the Minister for Public Works, Laurie Brereton. The original vision for Darling Harbour was ambitious. The initial plans for the area consisted of the following structures: Sydney Convention and Exhibition Centre, the centrepiece of the precinct, planned to be constructed as Australia's largest event space of any kind. The centre was planned to be built on the western side of the precinct, adjacent to Piermont Street being split by the Western Distributor. Harbourside Festival Markets, a shopping centre built adjacent, aimed to be the signature one of its type in the inner city. Harbourside would be built to the north of the convention centre, on the precinct's western side. Darling Harbour Casino, a major pillar of the project, as it was the key project that would deliver a return on investment off gambling tax. This was planned to be built adjacent to the eastern end of the Piermont Bridge, nearby Market Street. Sydney Maritime Museum, a museum dedicated to Sydney's extensive maritime history. The museum would be built to the north of Harbourside, on the western end of the precinct. Darling Walk, a small theme park described as a tomorrow's world of entertainment and technology, built on the eastern end of the precinct and directly adjacent to Harbour Street, opposite from the exhibition centre. Finally, the Chinese Garden of Friendship, a large garden designed by Sydney's sister city, Guangzhou, symbolising the friendship between China and Australia. The gardens will be built to the south of Darling Walk, also adjacent to Harbour Street and Liverpool Street. The Darling Harbour rail facilities closed in October 1984 to make way for the newly announced project. In 1986, road traffic on the Piermont Bridge permanently ended to allow the bridge to be converted to pedestrian traffic. The construction of Darling Harbour was met with numerous delays and setbacks. A handful of structures had problems in the planning process, causing their construction to not start for some time, such as the precinct's planned transport link to the city, TNT's controversial Harbour Link monorail, which didn't start construction until just a year prior to the earmarked opening date. Many of these buildings were completed in time for the bicentennial, but a number of these initially planned buildings or attractions fell through, or have been behind schedule. To put further pressure on developers, Brereton demanded that no project be allowed to start unless it is finished in time for the bicentenary. Merlin International, the designers of a Darling Walk Discovery Village concept, never ended up building Darling Walk, with a sports facility being built as an interim structure, opening in 1990. This image is all that exists of the original Darling Walk proposal. The casino, originally to be a Donald Trump casino, was never built in its initial location. The casino's license changed hands, and the casino's development occurred at a slow pace, continuing into the 1990s, until the eventual license awardee, Genting International, opted to build the casino away from Darling Harbour. This casino would later become the Star, which finally opened in 1997. The casino's planned site is now occupied by Cockle Bay Wharf, constructed in 2001. At the point of these cancellations, construction was already well underway. By the time construction was complete, the cost of building the whole Darling Harbour project grew to just over $500 million, or $1.1 billion in today's money. For the government, it was ultimately a risk that didn't pay off. The problems facing Darling Harbour's construction was a major cause of the government being voted out in the 1988 state election after 12 years in government. In the face of the project's enormous cost and the approval of a monorail as its sole means of transportation, which was subject to extensive criticism by the opposition and the Sydney City Council. The monorail, called the TNT Harbour Link, was paid for by TNT, one of Australia's largest companies at that point in time. The fact TNT paid for it attracted the state government when looking for transport links to the Darling Harbour precinct. The monorail system was described by the Transport Department as an attraction, as opposed to being a part of Sydney's public transport system, which is seen through the monorail system having no connections to City Rail or the bus network. A letter sent to the Sydney Morning Herald in July 1986 read that the monorail will only serve to further deface the city of Sydney. However, my major concern is not with the aesthetic damage that will be done to the city, but with the high-handed way its residents have been treated. However, in spite of its problems, Darling Harbour was officially launched by Queen Elizabeth II on the 4th of May, 1988. Only a few buildings were ready for the opening date. This included the Harbourside Festival Markets, the Sydney Aquarium, and the Convention Centre. As a testament to Darling Harbour's initial problems, for months, the Convention Centre was not served by any public transport, until the Harbour Link first opened, 6 months late in July 1988. The facility was served by the monorail's convention station, which is connected to the Convention Centre. Other areas in the precinct that would be served by stations included Harbourside, Haymarket, and planned stations at Darling Walk and the casino, which were not built initially. Despite the area's glamorous launch and good intentions, the Darling Harbour project proved to be a failure in the eyes of many. It was not a place for people, as the state government originally intended it to be, and in the space of only a few years, became nothing more than a tourist trap. Patrick Malone, in his book City, Capital and Water, cited how Darling Harbour is an escapist fun zone, so far removed from the ordinary functions of the city that even Sydney citizens are turned into tourists. By the early 1990s, the area's sole means of transportation, the TNT Harbour Link, had extensive downtime and had low patronage, and buildings such as the casino, which through gambling tax would have allowed the government to pay off the great costs associated with the Darling Harbour project, were delayed further and further down the line, disabling the government from ever being able to make back any of the money spent on the project. The state government was ready to write off Darling Harbour as a failure. However, in spite of this, there was a huge opportunity ahead for Darling Harbour in the form of the 2000 Olympic Games, which had been awarded to Sydney in 1993. Darling Harbour, which was considered Sydney's definitive tourist area, was looked upon as attractive to investors due to the single reason that it would more than likely attract the millions of visitors drawn to Sydney for the Olympics. With the state government hard at work getting the city ready for the Games, the Darling Harbour Authority had its own plans to expand the area. The authority signed on Jack Fund in mid-1994 to build the Darling Walk complex on the site originally reserved for Merlin's Park. This multi-purpose entertainment complex would bring numerous international brands to Australia. Darling Walk would most notably house SeaWorld, an indoor theme park which served as its anchor tenant, as well as a rainforest cafe, the One World Sports Bar, and numerous high-profile branded outlets. To the north of Darling Walk, the IMAX Theatre came to fruition, planned as the world's largest IMAX installation. Both attractions were announced in 1995 to be completed in time for the Games. Jack Fund's Darling Walk project replaced the temporary sporting facilities on the site, with the IMAX Theatre located just to the north. with construction on both attractions commencing in 1995. These attractions both opened to rave reviews in 1997, as tenants all across Darling Harbour were preparing for the lucrative 2000 Olympics period. The future of the area looked promising, as both Darling Walk and the IMAX Theatre performed well in the months following their launches. Also in the same year, TNT and the state government, in a public-private partnership, constructed the Sydney Light Rail. The light rail involved a conversion of the section of the abandoned Metropolitan Cargo Line, which ran behind the western side of Darling Harbour, giving an extra transport link to the area in the form of stops at the Convention Centre, Harbourside, and the Star Casino. The Convention Centre and Harbourside Shopping Centre were still meeting expectations 10 years after their opening. The former retained its crown as the premier convention centre in Australia from opening, continuing into the 90s, when it was outmatched in every category by a similar venue in Melbourne called the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre. Many major exhibitions and conferences were held at the centre. Some of these included the 2007 APEC meeting, the first Oz Comic Con, and a wide variety of expos in the fields of gambling, property, food services, construction, energy, boats, transport, waste and recycling, and even the adult entertainment industry. Harbourside continued to have regular tenants, and was making good money off the expensive rent charged to use floor space in the complex. When the year 2000 came, the Olympics frenzy extended to Darling Harbour. The convention centre was used for several Olympic events. These events were judo, wrestling, fencing and boxing. For the Olympics, that whole facility was given a major renovation from 1988 until early 2000, with a new building being added on the southern side of the centre. The fact that Darling Harbour played host to these events gave increased revenue to the surrounding attractions in the Darling Harbour area. For instance, the revenue of much of the stores in Harbourside surged because of the Olympics tourist intake. But as soon as the Olympics were over, Darling Harbour ventured back downhill again. By the end of the year, a major attraction in the area was gone, and the slow and steady decline of the rest of the area had begun. Jack Fun was by far hit the hardest of all the developers post-Olympics. Much of the tenants in its Darling Walk complex were already struggling well before the games had started. Just days after the games ended, SeaWorld closed its doors, leaving the complex without an anchor tenant. This triggered a mass exodus of tenants in the complex, as the Rainforest Cafe soon followed SeaWorld's closure, as did the One World Sports Bar. The company's future, as was the complex, was seriously bleak, which was made worse as a deal fell through with a Korean dinosaur theme park to take over SeaWorld as the complex's anchor tenant. Jack Fun ultimately exited Darling Harbour together, surrendering their lease to the Darling Harbour Authority for $10 million in March 2003. In the meantime, the Darling Walk complex would have McDonald's and a showroom for a Chinese furniture company as its only tenants, as the site started to be earmarked for development. Harbourside struggled too. In the 5 years following the Olympics, the shopping centre progressively became less tidy. Tenants started leaving and new tenants, specifically tourist shops, took their place, making the complex more reminiscent of a tacky tourist trap. The monorail was already struggling before the Olympics. The sheen of being able to view Sydney from above quickly wore off, and use of the monorail system was virtually only used by tourists. After the brief boost in tourism revenue after the Olympics, the monorail system went back to its old, outdated self, in no time fast. By 2007, Darling Harbour's structures ranged from 10 to 19 years old, and it was clear the area was outdated and in desperate need of a change. While the government could not reinvent the whole area, as the GFC was just around the corner, they started with reinventing Darling Walk. Following the $500 million sale of the Darling Walk site to Lendlease and the Commonwealth Bank, the first building to go was the Darling Walk complex, being demolished between late 2008 and early 2009, to make way for the Darling Walk Quarter office towers. This was the first structure to be completed in late 2011. 2013 would mark the next major redevelopment of Darling Harbour, with the government's eyes being focused on the convention centre and the monorail. By 2011, the monorail had further deteriorated and was on life support, barely clinging on as it sold very few tickets. following the acquisition of the monorail's operations by the state government. The system stopped operation in June 2013, being mostly removed by January 2014, bar some of the stations. Around the same time, the convention centre was announced to be replaced by a newer, more up-to-date structure. Demolition began in January 2014, with the new structure not being completed until late 2016. In 2015, the nearby entertainment centre bid farewell to Sydney, with its final show taking place at the end of 2015. The centre was demolished in early 2016 to make way for a huge apartment development that serves as an extension of Darling Harbour's redevelopment. It is planned to open by the end of 2019. The next year, IMAX was the next building to face the axe, closing in September 2016 to be knocked down and rebuilt. The IMAX Theatre will form part of a new development called The Ribbon, which includes a luxury hotel, along with the return of the IMAX Theatre. This building is still under construction, and is slated to be finished by the end of 2019. Now, the last remaining structure from the 1988 redevelopment is Harbourside. This building particularly stands out from the rest of the area, as is an outdated shopping centre with little to offer. The only major tenants of note in the centre are a Hard Rock Cafe and a bowling alley. Harbourside was originally to be replaced by 2019 with a new Harbourside and residential towers. However, a demolition date has yet to be confirmed. It will be a matter of time before this bites the dust too. Darling Harbour's rebuild has been criticised by many. Philip Cox, the architect of the Exhibition Centre, labelled the Convention Centre rebuild as an act of vandalism. I don't blame them for that. What was once planned as Sydney's eternal legacy of the bicentennial has almost been fully lost, with very few traces of what was originally supposed to represent 200 years of Australia as a nation. Totally rebuilt by one developer. Yes, that's right. You heard me. One developer. Rather than being a blend of different structures like the original, Darling Harbour's redevelopment has been totally rebuilt in Lend-Lease's image. A bland image of uninteresting, oversized glass monoliths, dominating the urban space like any other city. Architectural design is becoming more and more common in not only Sydney, but in cities around the world. Great examples of 20th century architecture being progressively pulled down to make room for messes like this. Rebuilding a city like this borders on vandalism. John Andrews, chief architect of the original convention centre, commented that, "Does it make sense to pull down $120 million worth of building? That's perfectly alright. As Australia, we just haven't grown up. We haven't developed any good manners, and we don't protect and look after our good things. I don't understand why the new architects are so keen to knock everything down. Why don't they just reuse things and add to them? Sure, the current facility is probably better than the other, in terms of it being more spacious for modern day presentations. But it is still an unsightly mess and looks terrible. Cities around the world combine these ugly glass mammoths with their historical structures to create a homogeneous look. Over time, more and more structures that represent the past will be replaced. It is a trend that is rapidly accelerating on a global scale. Unfortunately, the classic structures of Darling Harbour, the legacy of Australia's 200-year anniversary, have fell victim to this practice. Today, Darling Harbour is still Sydney's definitive tourist area. It is one of Australia's great public spaces. But the changes the area has seen in the last decade has made it almost unrecognisable when compared to its original self, 31 odd years ago. Where the story goes from here, I'm not exactly sure, but this is what Darling Harbour will be for the next few decades. What happens after that is a mystery.
Harbour, it seems, has always been under a cloud, controversial in the 80s and still today.
So it's nice, but I think it could do with a bit of a makeover. It looks a little bit old.
So anything in the way of development in this particular area, I'm all for it.
From train yards and dock to tourist hotspot, Darling Harbour has come a long way, but a modern makeover is close to completion. A new hotel, new exhibition centre and international convention centre are there. Near a Haymarket, one of the last pieces, Darling Square, including the new Exchange. It doesn't look like it now, but this will be a bustling food market, flash restaurant with a library and childcare above. Nearby, new apartments and what will be a boulevard and open town square. Lend-Lease is responsible for all of that.
People want to be living in the middle of vibrant areas that they can easily get access to things that they need to use. I think the future of this precinct will give them just that.
Rising up from where the IMAX cinema was, the W Hotel with a new IMAX. Not everyone is thrilled with the transformation. The architect involved with much of the original Darling Harbour, Philip Cox, is highly critical, saying that everything that made that unique is now being lost. As Public Works Minister in the mid-80s, Laurie Brereton spearheaded the original Darling Harbour. Today, he told 9 News, it was conceived as a place for people. Now it's the plaything of the hotel and convention world. It's a gross overdevelopment. That makes it worse, not better. Lend-Lease says change after 30 years was inevitable.
Density done well is critical to any city. We've put more public space back into Darling Harbour. Everybody loves a green space in the heart of the city.
So that's it. Season 1 of Abandon comes to a close. 1.5 years ago, I embarked on this journey to explore the lost. We've travelled around Australia, looking at SeaWorld, the Sydney Monorail, Wonderland, Dick Smith, the arcades of old, Ansett, the Sydney Football Stadium, Video Easy, and finally coming full circle to Darling Harbour. We won't be too long until we return, but next season we're going on a tour around the world. There are going to be interesting topics next season. Stay tuned. Season 2 will start this August. Until next time, this is me, signing off. Have a good one. Hey guys, thanks for watching this video all the way to the end. If you're new to this channel and missed out on the last video, check out the previous video here. If you like my content and want to see more, like, comment and press the subscribe button down below, and hit the bell notification so you never miss a video. I also have a Twitter and Twitch channel. If you'd like to check them out, the links to them are in the description.